Okay, so I'm actually pretty excited to talk about this one, because this is one of the few larger comic book series that I've actually managed to completely finish, and this whole thing went on for about like 60 issues worth, and yet I was able to grab it in like the 5 collected trade paperbacks, and they still stand proudly on my shelf to this day, and it still stands as one of my absolute favorite cyberpunk stories that I've ever read. So, Transmetropolitan is actually part of the DC Vertigo line. Now, for those of you who don't know, DC Vertigo was essentially the answer to DC, but for adults, essentially. This one covers a lot more darker storylines, stuff like V for Vendetta, or Swamp Thing, or Constantine Hellblazer, or 100 Bullets. See, it not only covered the magical side of DC, but it also covered more independent stories from the mainstream DC universe. And to be honest with you, I actually really like the idea of that, the concept of that, like doing more standalone stories that are more for adults than for like kids or teenagers. And Transmetropolitan definitely is for adults. Like I tell you right now, I have never seen so much straight up violence, even borderline racism in some cases, or just like full on, well, nudity. And to be honest with you guys, I enjoyed every second of this comic as I was reading it. Because it was so different from all the main DC superhero stories that I see plaguing comics these days. Well, mostly when it comes to Marvel and DC. Other times when it comes to other comics, either way. So, y'all know I'm a major science fiction fan, but this one definitely takes the cake as a gem because of the fact that, for one, it's not about superheroes and supervillains. It's more or less our main character, Spider Jerusalem, is in fact a journalist who in fact walks around the main setting of the storyline, which is in what's normally known as just the city. This massive cultural hybridization of just like from the poorest homeless man to like the richest bureaucrat. Either way, it's a whole hot pot of a mess with heavy crime and just so many things wrong with this place. Like, dear God, I don't even know where to begin. So humanity has essentially evolved a great deal. In fact, I think it's mentioned that they've actually colonized the stars. At least throughout this whole series, I hear mentions of how it's colonized across the solar system or something like that. But we don't really see that. It keeps itself grounded, despite this whole fantastic sci-fi setting that we're in. I like how the story actually manages to keep itself grounded into like the street level. Because that's essentially what Spider Jerusalem does. He goes around the city and talks about what he is seeing, the events that he witnesses, ranging from either police brutality against a minor or people to just straight up stupid stuff. Honestly, like racing around and you see like the hooker streets or something like that. He covers everything that he sees throughout the city, talking about it. And essentially, he is completely unfiltered. And I'm not gonna lie to you guys. The Spider Jerusalem has to be the biggest, unapologetic asshole you will ever see. And at the same time, he will crack you up to the point that you are laughing like a hyena. Or just cackling like a madman at the dark adult humor throughout this whole story. And honestly, I enjoyed it because of the fact that it actually shows some of these situations that we still see in society today. Things like racism on a smaller scale, thank God. But also other things like changing perspective, but also it shows life, how it sometimes can just go on in the city. Despite how grandiose and crazy it becomes, there's just life as it is. And honestly, I like how, again, it keeps itself grounded. So the whole storyline here, about all 60 issues of the comic, the first book, at least in the trade paperback wise, was essentially introducing us to Spider himself, as well as some of the other side characters, such as his two female assistants who essentially keep him from getting killed. And to be honest with you, some of the antics these people get up to is just it's absolutely laugh-worthy. You just sit there wondering how the hell are these people alive while just cackling like a madman. You have to wonder how Spider doesn't get himself killed with some of the crazy stuff he does. But anyways, so like I said, the first book, at least if you're picking up the trade paperbacks, it does start off a bit slow, because at first it's just introducing us to this whole scenario, like the big open city, this huge metropolis that he's in. And not to mention, it also shows the deep corruption within, as well as introduces us to many of the characters, like Spider Jerusalem and his two assistants. We get to know them, we get to see how they work, and then Volume 2, for me, is where it really picked up and brought us to the main storyline. So during Volume 2, essentially there is a massive election coming up of who's going to be the next President of the United States. And it is between two candidates, known as the Beast and the Smiler. I'm not sure if they ever mentioned the Beast's name, but the Smiler, also known as Callahan, essentially wins the election, and yet he somehow proves to be the absolute worst president ever seen. And you all will understand it whenever you pick up the books and see for yourself that this guy is a freaking maniac. He essentially wanted to be president so he could lord his power over other people. And while sick, at the same time, you know there are people like this who just want to be in power for the sake of just being on top of everybody else. And whenever Spider sees that, he sees just how corrupt this man is. He makes it his personal goal to screw with this man as much as possible. And throughout it all, seeing how much deeper and depraved Callahan is, the Smiler, as I will refer to him, seeing how crazy he is as the president, just the kind of stupid stuff that he gets up to, just because he can, it just makes you cheer for Spider just to take this guy out in one way or another. And Spider doesn't do it by like just going to the White House beating the crap out of him, no. He chooses to go through the people by exposing the truth of the president, and that is awesome. That's a nice little perspective. Because despite getting called out for his rash and just overall crude manner of journalism, a lot of people want it because Spider gives something that most news crews wouldn't do. He gives them the full, unfiltered truth, and that is his whole meaning here. The reason why he chose to be a journalist is he searches to give people the truth, unfiltered, uncut, and just full-on honest truth, not dilapidated over with lies and stuff. He gives it to them hard, and frankly, yes. So his whole campaign throughout the next 4 books, books 2, 3, 4, 5, it all continues to ramp up until it gets absolutely insane, from like mobs in the street, police brutality, and even at one point just a very massive storm. There are things like hired guns, crooks, assassinations, political unrest, crazy things that keep going on. And it keeps ramping up until eventually it reaches a very satisfying conclusion. Honestly, I cannot recommend this enough if you want a different and unique story. But mostly, the art style is what really sells it for me. Because, okay, I'm not going to lie to you guys, first of all. When I first started reading this series, at first it gave me a bit of a headache. Then again, I might have just been dealing with a migraine at the time, but just the one thing that'll stick out to you is just how bright these pages are. Because you see people and things of all shapes and sizes all crammed into this massive city. This massive metropolis, I should say. And you see just how bright and colorful everything is, but then you also see the dark side of it still there. That's what I think is funny. It's like that bright future that everyone wants, that bright and colorful looking future with advanced technology and humanity just going off and colonizing across the stars. And yet throughout it all, there's always going to be that dark underbelly right underneath the surface. And I will tell you now, I definitely like how some of these panels can sometimes look either hand-drawn and a little messy, just full-on digital, clean, and dark shaded colors. I think that's the point though. Sometimes it'll be a lighter color, like hand-drawn if it's just like a lighter story. Other times when it gets like to the digital look, I think that's when they're addressing it that this is a serious part of the storyline. So I actually like that change and shift in moods, depending on what the storyline is going to be, whether it's going to be a standalone chapter or if it's going to be part of the main whole story of just Spider Jerusalem versus the President of the United States. And that alone already set really high. So I will say this. Transmetropolitan lasted for about a good 60 issues of a comic series. That's pretty decently long if you ask me, especially considering the fact that it ended at a satisfying conclusion. And it comes in like 3 huge hardback editions, which if you're willing to spend a pretty penny, get those, or if you can, find yourself the collected edition trade paperbacks. You have the normal small ones, which collect like a few issues per. Me personally, I would recommend the ones that are like 5 books worth, and it's like a much more compacted, much larger trade paperback. They look amazing on the shelf, by the way. Either way, I'd actually recommend picking this up if you want a different perspective. If you want a nice standalone story that is not part of the mainstream DC universe, if you're up for something that's a bit more crass, a bit more rude, but also insane, funny, and just all around absolute mind-boggling insanity, as well as a bit of food for thought, really. Because I like some of these panels here. Sorry, going back here. But I like how sprinkled throughout the comic we get these little, like one page, I should say, little blogs or articles that Spider Jerusalem writes where he essentially talks about things throughout the city. Like either it's just walking down the street, the sights that he sees, the stories that are being told, or even just some of the absolute insanity that he gets up to with him and his assistants. And it's just, wow. Those are good for honestly breaking the tension and really just giving people a good laugh. But again, I would give this as a must read for those who want something a little bit different. Something that isn't just superheroes or anything like that. Like if you're up for something more darker, more mature for adults, and you're not afraid of some dark humor, I would recommend picking up Transmetropolitan and giving it a read at least once. Thank you all again for listening, and I'm so glad I finally got to talk about one of my absolute favorite comic series. Thank you all again for listening. Have an awesome day.